The sommelier was dead. Not literally, though the way Chef Armand Pichet was screaming into his phone in the kitchen corridor, you'd think someone had died. The man was pale, sweating through his linen jacket, and pressing his fist against his mouth, like he was trying to physically hold back a breakdown. The sommelier, the real one, the one who'd been flown in from Lyon specifically for this dinner, had rear-ended a taxi on the 405 and was currently being treated for a broken collarbone at Cedar Sinai. The dinner was in 47 minutes. The dinner that had taken 8 months to arrange. The dinner that had 3 Michelin-starred courses, a private cellar of wines worth more than most people's mortgages, and 12 guests who collectively controlled more global shipping contracts than the GDP of several small nations. At the center of it all sat one name on the reservation list that made everyone else's hands shake a little: Konstantin Vashenko. Shipping magnate, Ukrainian-born, London-based, and reportedly the kind of man who considered a wasted evening a personal insult requiring formal acknowledgement. Armand didn't know what to do. His assistant had called every certified sommelier in a 50-mile radius. 3 were at other events. 1 was in Napa. 1 had the audacity to be on vacation. Nora Callum was mopping the floor of the private dining room when she heard all of this. She kept mopping. This was the thing people never understood about being invisible. You heard everything. Every whispered phone call, every hushed argument, every crisis that the important people assumed couldn't possibly involve someone like her. Nora was 29, 5'4", and wore a size 22 in the dark green uniform that the Marquette Hotel provided to all its housekeeping staff. Her hair was pulled back under a cap. She had flour on her left sleeve from helping the pastry station that morning, because she'd been 2 stations over when they'd dropped an entire tray of millefeuille and someone needed to catch the plating assistant, who'd burst into tears. Nora was always 2 stations over when something went wrong. She had that quality, the ability to sense the shape of a crisis before it fully formed. Her grandmother had called it kitchen instinct. Nora thought of it less romantically. She thought of it as paying attention. She kept mopping. Armand kept pacing. His assistant kept scrolling through contacts on her phone with the expression of someone searching for survivors. "What about the evening staff? Is anyone certified?" "Certified in what?" the assistant said flatly. "Chef, certified sommeliers take 3 to 5 years of formal training. You don't just have one folded up in a linen closet." Armand pressed both hands to his face. Vashenko's people confirmed he's bringing 2 Russian-speaking associates. The Japanese delegation has a representative who refuses to communicate through anything but Japanese. The French contingent, Monsieur Delorme speaks English, the assistant said. "Monsieur Delorme speaks English the way I speak Mandarin," Armand snapped, technically and without mercy. "And if no one can guide the wine pairings in a way he actually respects, he'll dismiss this entire evening. He'll dismiss me," Armand said. "He'll tell Vashenko I'm a pretender. And if Vashenko thinks this dinner is amateur hour..." Nora finished the far corner of the room and began working her way back toward the door. She should have kept going. She knew she should have kept going. She had 7 more rooms before her shift ended, and her feet hurt, and she'd eaten half a granola bar for lunch because the staff meal had run out by the time she got there. She stopped. "The 2017 domain Lève Bâtard Montrachet," she said. Armand and his assistant both turned to look at her with the particular expression of people who had just heard a piece of furniture speak. Nora didn't look up from the mop handle. "For the sea base course," she said. "I saw the menu this morning when I was setting the table linens. The butter sauce is going to be too rich for most whites, but the Leflaive has enough minerality to cut it without fighting the dish. If Monsieur Delorme is the kind of traditionalist who..." She paused. "Sorry, I'll go." "Wait," Armand said. She waited. He walked toward her the way a man approaches something he's not sure is real. His eyes moved from her face to her uniform to the mop in her hands and back to her face again. "How do you know about the Leflaive?" Nora looked at him steadily. "I have my set level 4. The silence that followed was one of those very specific silences that happens when a room full of people has to rapidly revise every assumption it just made. "The set," Armand repeated. "Diploma level. I finished it 2 years ago. I've also got my certified specialist of wine from the Society of Wine Educators." She said it the way she said everything. Quietly, without drama, the same way she would have told him the thread count of the tablecloths. "I applied for the sommelier position here last spring. Twice. HR said I wasn't what they were looking for." Armand stared at her. Then he looked at his assistant. His assistant looked back at him with the expression of someone who was going to have a great deal to say later in private. "What's your name?" Armand asked. "Nora Callum. Nora." He exhaled. "I have a dinner in 46 minutes for 12 of the most difficult guests this hotel has ever hosted. I have no sommelier, and my career is currently hanging by a thread that some idiot taxi driver just severed on the 405. He looked at her mop, then at her. "Can you do this?" Nora thought about the 7 rooms she still had to clean. She thought about her feet. She thought about the granola bar. "Yes," she said, "but I'll need to change." The dress code for service staff at the Marquette was strict. Nora didn't own a sommelier's uniform. What she owned was a navy blazer she'd bought at a consignment shop in Culver City for $11, a pair of black slacks that fit her well because she'd tailored them herself, and a white blouse that she'd ironed that morning out of habit, not expectation. She looked at herself in the staff bathroom mirror. She looked like a woman who had been asked to present a wine list in 43 minutes and was going to do exactly that. She smoothed the blazer over her shoulders. It pulled slightly across the back because blazers were not designed for her body, but she'd learned long ago that you didn't wait for the world to accommodate your shape. You made do. You showed up anyway. She also, in the bathroom, reviewed the full wine list from memory. She'd seen it that morning. Once was enough. Konstantin Vashenko arrived at 7 on the dot, which said everything you needed to know about him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 55, with the particular stillness of a man who had not been surprised by anything in a very long time. His suit was charcoal. His watch was quiet. He moved through the lobby of the Marquette the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance while remaining completely unstoppable. Behind him came Dmitry Solov, who was his attorney, and Bogdan Kravets, who was described in the booking notes only as associate in the way that sometimes means bodyguard and sometimes means something else entirely. Both men were large. Both men were watching everything. The French contingent arrived 2 minutes later. Monsieur Henri Delorme was 71 years old, had published 4 books on Burgundian viticulture, and had the expression of a man who had been disappointed by most things for most of his life, and had made peace with this by making sure everyone around him was equally miserable. He walked in, looked at the room, looked at the table setting, and said something in French to his companion that Nora, standing near the surf station, caught perfectly. He said the glasses were too large. He was wrong. The glasses were Zalto Universals, which were exactly correct for the evening's pause, but Nora understood that Delorme wasn't making an observation. He was establishing dominance. The Japanese delegation, 3 representatives from Tanaka Global Logistics, led by a man introduced as Mr. Sato Kenji, arrived at 7:04. Sato spoke briefly to the concierge in accented but competent English, then switched to Japanese to speak with his colleagues, and Nora, who had spent 3 years working nights while taking Japanese language courses at a community college because she'd wanted to understand the wine literature that had never been fully translated, listened to what he said. He said the room was beautiful. He said he hoped the wine would be adequate. He said this in the slightly formal way of someone who had been disappointed before and was calibrating his expectations downward in advance. Nora picked up the wine list. It started, as these things always did, with the first pour. Armand had pulled the cellar selections she'd recommended, and she moved through the pre-dinner reception with a quiet efficiency that she'd spent years developing in other contexts. She was used to navigating around people without being noticed. She was used to anticipating what someone needed before they asked. The difference tonight was that people were looking at her. Not unkindly, mostly. Mostly with the particular confusion of people who had expected one thing and received something else. Delorme, at the edge of the reception room, was holding a glass of the 2019 Billicat Salmon Blanc de Blanc that she'd recommended for the opening and examining it with deep suspicion. As she passed, he spoke. In French, he said, "Who chose this champagne?" "It's not on the standard list." Nora turned. She answered him in French. She said, "You're right that it's not standard. It's from a private allocation that arrived last week. I thought the autolysis character would suit the smoked salmon course better than the house pour, but if you'd prefer." Delorme stared at her. She waited. She was good at waiting. He looked at his glass. He took a sip. A long, considered sip, the kind that meant he was doing the thing where you stop having an opinion and start actually tasting. Then he made a small sound in the back of his throat that was the closest thing to approval that Henri Delorme had probably produced in the last decade. "The dosage is low," he said. 3 grams, she agreed. "It's why the bubbles are so fine." He looked at her properly for the first time. "Where did you train?" "I didn't," she said simply. "Not formally, not in wine." Another pause. He looked at her blazer, at her shoes, at the mop calluses on her hands that no amount of lotion was ever going to fully fix. "And yet," he said. "And yet," she agreed, and moved on to the next table. The crisis came at the third course. It didn't announce itself the way crises usually did. It arrived quietly, the way the worst ones always do. In the form of Konstantin Vashenko leaning back in his chair and saying something to Bogdan in Ukrainian that made Bogdan's jaw tighten by a fraction. Nora was at the service station. She heard it. She set down the decanter she was holding. Vashenko had said, roughly, because Ukrainian wasn't her strongest language, but she'd spent 6 months with a tutor working through the fundamentals because she'd wanted to understand a specific wine region in Odessa, that the red being served was wrong. Not bad. Wrong. That it didn't match what had been discussed in the pre-dinner specifications that his office had sent 3 weeks ago. He was correct. The original specification had called for a 2015 Barolo from a producer in Serralunga d'Alba. The cellar had a 2016 instead, and no one had flagged the difference because to most people, a 1-year vintage variation from the same producer was close enough. To Vashenko, apparently, it was not close enough, and Nora had a feeling, based on the 15 minutes she'd spent reading his publicly available interviews on her phone in the bathroom before service, that this wasn't really about wine. Vashenko used precision as a form of respect. He expected it from others the same way he exercised it himself. The vintage discrepancy was small. The principle was not. She walked to his end of the table. She addressed him in Ukrainian. The table went quiet in that way. Tables go quiet when the air pressure in a room suddenly changes. She said, in Ukrainian, speaking carefully, because her accent was imperfect, but her vocabulary was precise, that she was aware of the substitution, that she owed him an explanation, and that she wanted to offer him something that she believed would honor the original spirit of his selection, rather than simply replace it. He looked at her. He was not a man who looked surprised easily. He looked surprised. He answered in Ukrainian. He asked her where she'd learned the language. She told him, evening classes, 18 months, a tutor who'd grown up in Kharkiv. She told him she'd started because she was working through the wine literature of the Odessa region, and most of the best writing had never been translated. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, also in Ukrainian, that Odessa wine was underrated. Extremely, she agreed. What would you offer instead? He said, switching now to accented but fluent English, as though he'd decided she'd earned the upgrade. A 2013 from Masolino, she said. Same commune, older vintage, better year. The tannins have had time to integrate in a way the 2015 hasn't fully reached yet. I think it'll be closer to what you were imagining. He considered this. Then he nodded, once the small, precise nod of someone who has decided to extend trust on a limited trial basis. She went back to the cellar. At the dessert course, Sato Kenji caught her arm as she passed. He spoke to her in Japanese. He asked, with the careful politeness of someone who had been told no before and was braced for it, whether she might be able to recommend a late-harvest wine that would pair with the yuzu tart without overwhelming the citrus. She answered in Japanese. His eyebrows rose. She answered in Japanese about wine, which was a specific thing she'd wanted to be able to do ever since she'd read a particular Japanese book about fermentation that had made her cry on a Tuesday night in her apartment 3 years ago, and which she had now made happen by spending every Tuesday and Thursday evening for those 3 years sitting in the back row of a community college class. He said, "Your Japanese is very natural," she said. "I had a good teacher, and the textbooks were honest about how hard it was." He smiled. She recommended, it was a real Smarvus Riesling from the Mosel, told him exactly why in Japanese, and watched his face do the thing faces do when someone explains something you already half knew but couldn't quite articulate. "You understand fermentation," he said. "I find it interesting," she said. "The way it transforms things." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a conversation about dessert wine. "You do not belong in this role," he said. It was not unkind, it was direct. "I know," she said. "What happened?" She thought about the HR emails, the 2 applications, the way the website had said they were looking for someone with the presence and polish that our clientele expects, which was a particular kind of language that meant a particular kind of thing. "Wrong packaging," she said simply. Sato looked at his wine, then at her. "That seems like their loss," he said. She moved on before he could see that the comment had landed exactly where it was most likely to do damage. After the dessert course, Vashenko asked Armand for a word. Armand came back from that conversation looking like a man who'd fallen into the ocean and discovered he could breathe underwater. He found Nora in the cellar, returning bottles to their racks. "He asked who you were," Armand said. "I know. He wants to know if you're available for a private dinner next month. He's hosting something at his home in Malibu." Armand looked at the floor, then at the wall, then with some effort at her. "He asked specifically for you, by name." Nora put the last bottle in its rack. "I applied for the sommelier position twice," she said. "I know," Armand said. "I read your file today. After you," he stopped. "The person who reviewed your application noted that you didn't have restaurant floor experience. I've been working restaurant floors for 4 years. In housekeeping," he said. And then, because he was clearly a man having a very uncomfortable private reckoning, which they apparently considered different, Nora looked at him. She wasn't angry. She'd been angry about this for a long time privately, in the small hours of the night when the rejection emails came, and she had to decide whether to keep going or let it hollow her out entirely. She'd made her choice. She was still here. That had to mean something. "What are you offering?" she said. Armand straightened. He was, to his credit, not a cowardly man. He'd been wrong about something and he was going to address it directly, which put him ahead of most people she'd dealt with in this industry. "The sommelier position," he said. "Full role. Starting Monday, if you'll take it." The cellar was quiet. Somewhere above them, she could hear the guests beginning to move toward the exit. The sound of chairs and conversation, and the specific buzz of an evening that had gone against all probability. "Well, I want the title," she said, "on the door, on the staff page. Not wine specialist or cellar coordinator, sommelier." "Yes, and I want the salary that was listed in the original posting, not adjusted. Yes, and I want an apology in writing from HR for the language in the rejection letter." Armand blinked. "That's optional," she said, "or necessary?" A pause. "I'll make it happen," he said. She nodded. She picked up the last bottle that needed returning, slid it into place, and turned off the cellar light on her way out. The night air outside the service exit was cool and smelled like eucalyptus from the garden the hotel kept for the photo opportunities at the South Terrace. Nora sat on the step, the same step where she'd eaten half a granola bar 9 hours ago, and texted her roommate. "You up?" The response came back in 30 seconds. "Always. Why do you sound weird in a text?" She laughed. She didn't know she could sound weird in a text. She typed, "I start my new job Monday." A pause. Then Nora, what happened? Then a string of things that weren't words. She smiled at her phone. She thought about Sato's face when she'd switched to Japanese. She thought about Delorme's long, reluctant pause before conceding the champagne. She thought about Vashenko, who had not been surprised by very many things in a very long time, looking at her like she was something he hadn't accounted for. She thought about the years, the Tuesday evenings, the textbooks, the community college classrooms where she sat in the back because the chairs in front didn't have armrests wide enough, and she'd learned to stop fighting that particular battle. The granola bars eaten standing up because staff meal ran out. The HR email that had said, in carefully neutral language, that she wasn't what they were looking for. She looked up at the sky above the hotel. In LA, you couldn't see many stars, but you could see enough. You could see the ones that had been there long enough and burned bright enough to make it through all that light pollution. She put her phone in her pocket. Tomorrow she'd clean out her housekeeping locker. Monday she'd walk through the front entrance. She'd been here the whole time. They'd just needed the right crisis to finally look.